Hello, and welcome to the next lesson in our Judges series. And today we will begin looking at Judges chapter 15, which is the continuation of the Samson story. This would be episode 3 of the Samson story and the continuation of his marital problems. But before we do that, let us go ahead and open with some prayer. Most gracious and loving God, in all things, we look to you for our wisdom. We look to you for our guidance. We look to you for where we should go and what we should do. And so we ask you now to watch over us, to guide our minds, guide our spirits. Help us see the wisdom in your words. Watch over us and have your words have meaning to us so that we move forward into our days and into our lives with the wisdom of God in our hearts. And through all things, we thank you and we praise your name. Amen. Last week we got, for the last 2 weeks we've been looking at the Samson saga. And this is the third part of the Samson saga. The first part was the announcement and his birth. The second episode was his marriage to the Philistine. We kind of left that story last week where Samson was angry over what had happened to him, and he had stormed off in a rage. The story is not absolutely clear on this, and so we don't know whether he actually did the final marriage ritual, which would have been entering the woman's tent and finalizing the marriage. We don't know if that occurred. It looks like from the story that actual scene, that final moment where the marriage was consummated, actually did not occur. And so we don't know in the story. It kind of hints that it didn't. And so we'll find out. We won't find out. But what we will find out is what happens next. So, picking up with our story, Judges chapter 15, beginning with verse 1. After a while, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife, bringing along a kid. He said, "I want to go into my wife's room." But her father would not allow him to go in. Her father said, "I was sure that you had rejected her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister prettier than she? Why not take her instead?" Samson said to them, "This time, when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame." So Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and took some torches, and he turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and burned up the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. Then the Philistines asked, "Who has done this?" And they said, "Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken Samson's wife and given her to his companion." So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father. Samson said to them, "If this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I have taken revenge on you." He struck them down hip and thigh with great slaughter, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. So as our story moves forward today, we find out here that a little time has elapsed. If I remember right, and I did not look back, but if my memory is serving, the wedding took place earlier at the time of the barley harvest. And now it's the wheat harvest, which is about 2 to 3 weeks later, maybe even a month later. So a little while has elapsed, maybe about a month or so, and Samson has gone to go visit his wife. So he believes at this point that she's his wife, and so he's going to go and visit his wife. And he brings along a baby goat. He brings the meal with him, And so he wants to go and visit with his wife and maybe even continue the marriage. He's gotten over being angry, and now he's ready to kind of, okay, all right, I'm past all that. Let's see if we can work this out. And we note here also that this is still following the custom of the Philistines. The Jewish custom would be for the wife to come to the husband's home. The Philistine custom is that the husband goes to the wife's father's home. So he's returning to where his wife lives. This could also be one of those marriages that is a distant marriage, is that he continues to live in his hometown and she continues to live in her hometown, and he comes and visits her on occasion. This could be that type of marriage, or at least it appears that actually may be the way this marriage is set up. Well, anyway, regardless of any of that, he has come to visit his wife, and he brings along the meal for that event. He arrives there, and he tells his father-in-law that he wants to go in and see his wife, that he wants to go into his wife's room. And again, that would mean then that he wanted to consummate the marriage, consummate this wedding here, this marriage. And so at this point we find out that the father wouldn't let him go in, and he lets him know that, we were pretty sure that you despised her, that you had rejected her. And the word here, again, we in the translation that I've read to you, it has the word rejected her, which has the meaning that we're looking for. The actual word that used has more of it's normally translated despised. But this despised, referring back again to the Levitical laws, is the word that's used whenever you turn away a woman because you want a divorce. And so what the father-in-law is telling Samson is that I was sure that you had divorced her, so I gave her to your best man. Now, again, the translation I have is your companion. The Hebrew text, the Jewish Bible text from the Tanakh, from the standard Jewish translation, has that word as best man, or first bridegroom. But of course, we also know that this companion, this bridegroom, was a Philistine. Remember, he was presented to Samson as the bridegroom, and also kind of as the guard in some ways, to watch over Samson, because again, he's a scary fellow. Well, we find out that the father had given the bride, the wife, to this other Philistine fellow from the town. And then he goes on to try to placate this. And again, this falls well within the law of both the Philistine people, the Canaanites, and the Jewish people in this area here, is that if the first, if a situation arises like this, the father has every right to, and it's part of the law, is that he could give him instead the second daughter, or a younger daughter. If we fall back and remember, this is the story of Samson, but if we were to go back to the story of Jacob, Jacob goes to his father-in-law, and he works for his father-in-law for 7 years so he could get Rachel, but his father-in-law instead gives him the older daughter Leah, and he has to work an additional 7 years. He has to wait a week and then work an additional 7 years. He has to wait a week, then he gets Rachel as his bride, and then he has to work an additional 7 years to work off the bride price for the second wife, the younger daughter, Rachel. So this fits within that framework of how you can do this sort of thing. And so the father offers a solution to Samson's frustration over losing his wife, is I'll give you my younger daughter instead. And in fact, she's even prettier than the first daughter. Well, Samson wasn't going for it. If we look back at the first story here, the first half of this story from last week, we find out that Samson was besotted by her. He really loved her. at least in his mind, he was in love with her. And so the father offering up the younger daughter isn't really helpful to him as far as he's concerned, because he has a love for the older daughter, the one that he thought he was marrying. And so he rejects this idea. And in fact, what he does is he doesn't just blame the father-in-law, he blames the entire Philistine people because of his actions here that we see. This time, when I do mischief to the Philistines, I will be without blame. Again, instead of it being between the man and the father, between Samson and the father-in-law, between, individuals, they have turned it into a national thing, a national pride thing, just like the riddle. The riddle, they turned into from a wedding party game to a national competition between Samson and the Philistine people. And that's what's done here. Now Samson turns it over and he says, because you did this, I am going to punish a whole bunch of your people, the Philistines. And he says, and because of what you've done, when I do this, I'm going to be without blame. I will not have any blame laid on me for this, because this is retribution. This is a payback. Story tells us here that he goes out and he catches himself 300 foxes. I want to point to the number here. If we go back, how much... if we go back, what we see is we see the number 3 first, and then we have the number 30, number of companions. Excuse the interruption. I had a phone call from one of my parishioners that I needed to take. So picking up where we left off, or where I left off, that I think I was talking about the numbers. If you look back in the story, the number 3 and variations of the number 3 are flow through this whole story. It starts with the number 3. Then the next number is 30, and that's where they have 30 companions and so forth. Now the number is up to 300, and I want you to pay attention as we move forward. And the next number in that sequence should be 3,000. And let's see if the number 3,000 shows up as we move forward with the story. So he collects up 300 foxes, and I'm imagining in my head how he's doing this, and of course this is one of those fantastical stories. Again, this is kind of one of those superhero stories where he can run around and he can catch all these foxes. He can catch 300 of them and somehow keep them all, all in one place, all at one time, and ties them all together. And he takes and I can imagine him taking a piece of rope. And the way that's kind of described is, if you go and look in a couple of the other translation of this, he turns the tails, tail to tail. But what I think what's actually happened is he has a piece of rope, and he loops the rope over the 2 foxes, and he spins it up so that it's tight on the tail, but not so that it would hurt the fox. And then he ties a torch to that which he lights on fire, and he does this to 300 foxes, and he lights them all on fire, and he sends them out. And I can imagine as the foxes are running, they're running from each other, and they're running from the fire that's behind them, that eventually the rope that he's tied to their tails comes loose, it unturns, and falls off. And so I'm going to look at it that way, because otherwise I feel bad for the foxes. As it is, they just had a terrible fright. That they weren't actually harmed in this. There were no animals harmed in the production of this story. Well, anyway, he ties these in some manner or form. He ties into 150 pairs of foxes. It's 150 torches, and he lets them go into the wheat field. And they run through, the foxes running through the wheat fields, lights the field on fire, and the grain is burning, and the standing grain is burning. and the grain that has already been collected is burning, and all of this is burning, and it also that catches fire to the vineyards. The grapevines start catching on fire, and also the olive groves catch on fire. This is pretty bad. I think this is a bad thing here. This is not a good thing that Samson has done. What he's also done is he's taken away the Philistines' food, their drink, and their oil, which is, again, olive oil is used not only in cooking, but it's also used in ceremonies, in religious ceremonies. So he's damaged them in 3 different ways, 3 different targets by doing this. Well, the Philistines, after this has happened, they start looking around and trying to figure out who did this. I mean, this was an obvious attack, because you just don't get 300 foxes running with the tails on fire or with torches tied to their tails. Is not a natural thing to happen. So they want to know who did this. And it comes out that the son-in-law of the Timnite. I want you to note this here, that Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, did this because he has taken Samson, because the father-in-law took Samson's wife and gave her to Samson's companion. That's the way the story is reading is. So they're blaming, actually they're blaming Samson, but they're blaming Samson and what motivated Samson to do this? The father-in-law. And so they go and they punish the father-in-law and Samson's wife. All through this story, this woman is referred to him and his wife. And so I'm going to really say that in Samson's mind, and even in the mind of the author, the writer of this story, is this woman actually was Samson's wife. Well, they come and they kill both of them, actually fulfilling what they threatened her with. Remember, if we go back to the riddle, after 4 days they hadn't been able to figure it out, they went and threatened the wife. You either you either find us the answer to this, or we will burn you out. Well, that's what they did. After she gave in, she gave them the answer. They provided the answer, this and cause and effect, and it ends up that she gets burned out anyway. Well, this sets Samson into an absolute rage. They burned her, they burned her father, and so now Samson screams into them, if this is what you want to, if this is what you do, I swear I will not stop until I've taken revenge on you. Now he says, I'm not going to stop until I kill all of you. And he goes in, and he goes into one of those battle rages, and again, the Hulk comes out in him. And the way is the wording in this is beautiful. One of the things we need to remember is that the Hebrew language, the language that this was originally written in, and this includes some of the Greek, because Greek even does this, not half as much as the original Hebrew language, is that a lot of times the Hebrew language is in metaphor. It uses a lot of words to say something very simple. He did a great slaughter here. He struck them down hip and thigh with great... He gave them a thorough thrashing. In other words, what is down hip and thigh? In our modern term, to view this, let's look at this as a picture. A word picture, which is a lot of the Hebrew language is word pictures. And what it is that, let's say you have and please forgive me for this, but you have a slave, and you want to punish that slave, and this slave has done something really egregious, but not enough to death penalty him, but punishment in this is going to be extreme. And normally, what you do, you'd bend the fellow over and you would stripe him on the buttocks and the thigh, the upper leg part, because there's a lot of skin there. There's a lot of that can take a lot of punishment. So you can beat them there. And please forgive me for this, but you can beat somebody there, and yes, it causes a lot of damage, but the damage heals and relatively well. But what this is saying is it's not just down the hip and down into the thigh, but if you go and back and look at it's not just the butt, but it's also the thigh. And so normally it would be just the buttock, but here it's saying but also the thigh. And so it's a thorough thrashing in this, and this is a great slaughter. He finishes out this slaughter, and he goes and he stays in the cleft of the rock of Etam. Now, he's staying in a crack in a rock in Judah. Edom is in Judah, and so he has retreated from the territory of Dan, which is where his home was, and he's retreated into the territory of Judah. Picking up now with verse 9. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. The men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Etam, and they said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then have you done to us?" He replied, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." They said to him, "We have come down to bind you, so that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Samson answered them, "Swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me." They said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will not kill you." So they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So, again, the Philistines have moved into, because Samson has gone into this place called Etam. He's hiding there, and Etam is in the territory of Judah. The Philistines have come into Judah to go find Samson, and they raid a small town called Lehi. This, of course, gets the attention of the Judahites, and the men of Judah arrive there, and they come up to them and say, "Hey, what? Why are you here? Why have you come against us? We have been faithful in giving our tribute to you. We have been very faithful in your dominance over us. And why have you come against us?" Well, we've come to bind Samson, to do to him as he did to us. So we've come here to capture and take away Samson. And since he burned out our fields and all that, we're going to burn it, is what they're really saying. That's what he did to us, and so that's what we're going to do to him. Well, 3,000 men of Judah. There's the number 3,000. Remember I told you, we had 30, then 300. Now we're at 3,000. And so 3,000 Judahites, 3,000 men of Judah go to Etam there, to where Samson is. And they question Samson in this because maybe Samson wasn't aware of their situation. I think actually they're asking him more like, "Don't you know this? You should know this. Don't you know this? That we are dominated by the Philistines. They rule over us. We give them tribute. And we do that because if we don't, they'll come and beat us up. So what have you done to us? Why have you brought this trouble to us?" Well, his reply is, again, it's moved from being a personal affront between Samson and an individual to a national issue now between 2 nations, between 2 peoples. So not only the Philistines are now involved, but also the men of Judah are involved. And so we have these 2 nations now. This has risen itself from a personal vendetta to a national problem. And his response is personal. What they did to me, I did to them. As they did to me, so I have done to them. So we have this tit for tat. The Philistine says, we want him so that we can do to him what he did to us. And now Samson says, they want to do to me what I did to them because I did to them what they did to me. And so it's just going back and forth. And it's escalating. It's moved up into now it's a national problem. It's an international problem. It's between two nations now. It's between two peoples. And one of them is already under the domination of the other. And they don't want any more part of this. So they said, well, no, we've come down here to take a hold of you and hand you over to the Philistines. That's what we're here to do. And remember, they brought 3,000 men. And Samson really doesn't want to fight his fellow countrymen. He doesn't want to fight his brothers. And Samson being a Danite and Judah being Judahite. And if you remember that these brothers are related. And so they swear to me, is Samson's response to them, swear to me that you yourselves will not attack me. So what he's saying is, if you promise that you won't kill me, I'll go with you. They said, no, we only want to bind you. We only want to take you out and get us out of our hair and give you to them. We will not kill you. Apparently he agrees, so they bring 2 new ropes and they bind him up. And they bring him up from the rock and take him to the Philistines. It is, I want you to take note of that line there. They bound him with 2 new ropes. That phrase comes into play in next week's story, and I'll try to remember to bring this back up. That the 2 new ropes play a part of the next story also. Okay. Picking up now with verse 14. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Then he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached down and took it, and with it he killed 1,000 men. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. When he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone, and that place was called Ramoth Lehi. Okay, so if you remember, when the Philistines first came into the Judahite territory, they made a raid on Lehi. So now they're bringing Judah is bringing Samson to Lehi, where the Philistines are. Just so you know, just kind of it's part of the humor of the story, and it plays a part in it's part of the humor of the story is that Lehi means donkey or ass. It means donkey, and so they come to the place called Donkey, where all of this is taking place. It is all taking place in the place called Donkey. It's just part of the humor in the story. There is a lot of humor in this, and these riddles and these rhymes and these things also have a lot of humor and also irony in them in a lot of ways. So they as they bringing him to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him. They were doing their war cry, their battle cry. And so, like a lot of you may see this in movies or so forth, or those of you who were in the military or within the Marines or whatever, know that usually that a lot of time there's a battle cry that's always yelled out. Marines scream, "Hoorah!" I know the Army has something very similar to that in sound, but that's what Marines shout, is "Hoorah!" And that's what moves you forward. Well, they come and rush at him, or they come at him with this battle cry. Well, the battle cry that they shout out at him causes that Hulk in him to rise up. And it says the Spirit of the Lord rushed on him. I want to go back to this again. I know I mentioned it before, but this is one of those rare examples of of the Spirit of God, a different kind of Spirit of God entering into somebody. Now, this is the same Spirit of God that always enters into Samson. It makes him all Hulk out and charge ahead and go into battle as a superhero. This is all that. It's the same, but that's different than the Spirit of God that enters into other people at other times. Usually, what's really interesting, all the way up to this point here, when the Spirit of God moved into somebody, the previous judges that this happened to, it gave them tactical wisdom. It gave them the ability to lead an army, to do that. It increased their own talents and skills in that area, and God's Spirit enhanced the human what they naturally had. It enhanced it. And that's exactly what happens here to Samson, but the Spirit of God that's moved in here isn't the spirit of that peaceful Spirit of God. It isn't that wisdom Spirit of God. This is that warrior spirit. This is the mountaintop God that's entering into Samson. And so it's a very hostile God. And that's kind of, so that it's kind of, you need to understand that. This is a slightly different understanding of that Spirit of God. It's a different face of that Spirit of God. It rushes on him, and as it rushes on him, and again, flax and fire, fire is all again part of this. It's like the bonds just catch fire, and they just melt off of his hands. He finds the jawbone of a donkey, and again, this place is called Lehi. This place is called Donkey. And he finds a fresh jawbone of a donkey. He takes it, and with it he kills 1,000 men. Jawbone and the donkey, all of that play into the humor of the story, but it also plays into the irony of the story. And so he kills 1,000 men with this jawbone of a donkey. And he then shouts out this piece of... it is a mixture of a riddle and a poem, but it's mostly it's a mixture of a riddle and a poem. Is with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps. With the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. It sounds horrible in English. It doesn't really. The heaps upon heaps and the 1,000 men are words in the original language that had a similarity to sound. Which just can't be repeated or can't be replicated into English. But this is actually a rhyming sequence where the words heaps upon heaps rhymes with have slain 1,000 men in the original language. But we lose that here. Unfortunately, we lose that. When he had finished speaking this little bit of poetry, this little bit of a rhyme, this little bit maybe even of a riddle, he throws away the jawbone, and in that place from that point on is called Ramath Lehi, which means the place of the hill of the donkey, or it's called the hill of the donkey. Is what this is. Ramath is the hill, and Lehi is donkey, and so it's the hill of the donkey, or the donkey hill, however you want to put it that way. So this place becomes a well-known place. So he added to it is this place where this battle took place, becomes known as Donkey Hill. Okay, picking up now with verse 18. By then he was very thirsty, and he called on the Lord, saying, You have granted this great victory by the hand of your servant. Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised? So God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came from it. When he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore it was named En Hakor, which is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So after this great battle, where he kills 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, he's thirsty. And he calls on Adonai. Now I want you to we see Samson here in another. Samson is ruled by his libido, his desire for women, as we will see. There are two more women in the story of Samson as we move forward. His problems with women first, but he has a desire for women. He needs nourishment a lot. We see that with the honey, with his need for the nourishment there, and also now we have the water. And so he is very firmly grounded in being a human being, but at the same time he has there's a great need in his life for these sorts of things. Well, at the end of this battle, he's very thirsty. Now, I want you to note here when he did the little bit of poetry here, he says, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heap upon heap, with the jawbone of a donkey, I've slain 1,000 men." God isn't mentioned. "I have done this," is what Samson says. But then when he's thirsty, when he needs something, he calls on Adonai, and then gives the victory to God, gives the victory to Adonai. "You have granted this great victory by my hand of your servant, by the hand of your servant. Am I now to die of thirst and fall into the hand?" After doing what you have empowered me to do, and after the victory that you have given me, do you want me to just thirst to death? Is that what it is? Now I'm just going to thirst to death and fall, and then the Philistines will come and get me? Is that how this is going to be, God? And so God, I note in all of this that God is silent. God never speaks after the announcement of Samson's birth. God does not speak anywhere in here. He moves, he has action in the story, but he never speaks. So here he calls on God, "Am I going to die of thirst?" God never speaks to him, but he does split open a hollow place there at Lehi, and water comes out of it. And the name In Hakor is the one who called, and so this is the place where calling on God gets a response. And so the name of the place is the one who called, which is at Lehi to this day. And again, when the story was written, these two places were still known about, and where they were. According to the story, they were still known. We have this very strange interludal statement, and he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. It doesn't give them peace or anything else, and the story isn't over. This is normally at the end of the individual judge's story, but here I'm telling you the story isn't over. We've still got two more whole aspects to the story that we haven't hit yet, and that we're going to come into beginning next week, or starting next week. But this does tell us one thing for sure. Although the story continues, this does tell us one thing: that there was still no peace. That he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines for 20 years, but there was no peace. There was no rest. And so this was not a restful time. There's still the Philistines are still there. The Philistines are still causing trouble. The Philistines are still dominating the Hebrew people, the sons of Jacob. And that will not stop at this point. It's going to continue for at least the next 20 years, or all the days that he is the judge. It continues. Well, that's kind of our story for today. That's our portion of the story for today. Next week we will pick up with Judges chapter 16, and we will meet the next two women in the life of Samson. I look forward to that. I hope you enjoyed this class this week, and I look forward to seeing you next week for Judges chapter 16. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord. And all God's people said, Amen.